In the early morning hours of August 21st, 1992, on Ruby Ridge in northern Idaho, 6 armed U.S. Marshals made their way to the mountaintop home of Randy and Vicki Weaver and their children, where for months the family had lived in isolation with a cache of firearms. What followed was a firefight and a standoff that captivated the nation and led some Americans to question whether the federal government, their government, was out of control and subjugating its own people. A new American experience documentary, Ruby Ridge, looks at this moment in history that some claim gave rise to the modern America militia movement. Let's take a quick look.
On American Experience.
Got a guy barricaded in a cabin, armed to the teeth. He's got his family in there with him.
Federal judge wanted him to come to court, and he was refusing to do that.
FBI agents surround the cabin.
We were being hunted. That's how it felt.
At that point, there was a shootout.
When it was all said and done, Sammy and Vicki Weaver were dead.
Ruby Ridge on American Experience.
Joining us now is the director and writer of the documentary, Barack Goodman. Barack, always good to have you here.
Nice to be here. Thanks.
Whenever you come, I know we're going to have an interesting conversation about something that we need to know about. What do you think it was about this that grabbed people so dramatically and still to this day has not let them go?
I think it was the spectacle of it. There's a family of 5 people and a friend up there, and surrounded by really an overwhelming force of FBI agents, local police, state police. It was the imbalance of it. It was this sort of, how could this happen in America? How could this family, who just wanted to live apart and live alone, be subject to this kind of police action? Now, it's of course a much more complicated and deep story. There was a shooting which resulted in the death of a law enforcement agent along with the 14-year-old child of this family. So when that happens, there's sometimes an overreaction, a strong reaction from federal law enforcement, and that's what happened in this case. But I think just those images of that tiny cabin up on the hill, rustic cabin, and this overwhelming helicopters and vehicles, armed vehicles and so on, that really, I think, shocked a lot of people.
Let me ask you about the Weavers. Who were they?
They're a complicated story. They came from Iowa. Randy and Vicki Weaver were deeply, deeply religious. And Vicki in particular began to believe in a sort of coming Armageddon, an apocalypse where the forces of evil would be overtaking Christian America. And they needed to escape to the mountains. So the family left Iowa, in the midst of a farm crisis, by the way, and came to Idaho and built this cabin. They wanted to live apart, live in safety. And the problem was that Randy Weaver, and even the whole family, began to attend social gatherings at a place called the Aryan Nations, which was a very, very worrisome place for federal law enforcement. It was a place that bred a kind of white supremacist, anti-government, terrorist character. And Randy was there glancingly. He didn't join the organization, but he became a target of a government sting operation where they wanted him to become an informant. He refused. They tried to bust him, and that's what set the whole thing in motion. So the family were white separatists. They were people who wanted to live apart, but they weren't dyed-in-the-wool white supremacists. They certainly weren't a threat to anybody. And yet they resisted any attempt to be brought in or to be sort of voluntarily come to court. They instead retreated to their cabin, expecting that this was in fact the end of the world about to happen.
What was the feeling on the law enforcement side?
Well, a federal agent, a U.S. Marshal named William Deegan, had been killed by one of actually a family friend of the Weavers who was staying with them. And so I think that more than anything inflamed the passions of law enforcement, who are, after all, human beings. But what was really hard to understand and hard to explain was that the FBI issued rules of engagement for the first time in their history, which basically said, you may shoot at this family without any provocation. If you see them, an adult carrying a gun, and they always had guns, this family, you are not only permitted but encouraged to shoot them. No surrender warning, no warning whatsoever. And that order, that rule of engagement, which the FBI has since acknowledged was illegal, led directly to the death of Vicki Weaver, and I think really inflamed the far right in this country.
So shifting your lens forward from this, what is the message? What is the lesson we should be learning?
What struck me about the Ruby Ridge story in particular was the dangers of conspiracy thinking on both sides. Each side came to inflate the danger of the other. From the point of view of the Weavers, law enforcement, the federal government was the devil, was Satan, was Armageddon personified, and they therefore acted irrationally. As Sarah Weaver herself says, they acted out of fear. Similarly, with the federal government, came to see this small family, this basically harmless family, as domestic terrorists, potential life-threatening force. So when that happens, and again, I'll quote Sarah, that when fear drives action, terrible things can happen. And you're seeing that all the way through since. You see it before, certainly where we are today. We have to seek in the other, in the opponent, the better angel, not the worse angel. And unfortunately, sometimes in these conflicts, the opposite happens, I think.
Well, it is, and not surprising for your work, it is an insightful and compelling look at a troubling time in our history, worth seeing, certainly. And it's always good to talk to you.
Nice to talk to you, too.
You be well. A programming note, American Experience Ruby Ridge airs tonight at 9 p.m. on 13.